First, I was a counsel to the Senate Banking Committee back in 1991 when we enacted ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. That's when we knew how to do acronyms. And that was a traditional infrastructure bill. It was a surface transportation bill that under Senator Cranston and Senator Moynihan's leadership tried to flex more and more funding from traditional highway funding to transit and so forth. And then in 2008, 2009, was part of drafting and then delivering the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And that was at that time, a very large investment to provide a way forward out of the Great Recession, $787 billion at that time. So now we fast forward to today, and we've been through, obviously, a global pandemic. We're going through a racial reckoning. We've got climate change looming. And with the passage of the 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, and however we begin to size the American Jobs Plan, which is to some extent being broken apart into different bits, both the definition of infrastructure beyond surface transportation to include energy and broadband and housing and resilience changes this moment from that 1991 ICE-T effort. And the size of what we're talking about is really historic and unprecedented. We just keep using the T word, trillion, as opposed to billions. And given the long-standing deferment of investment in American infrastructure, particularly for those of us who live on the East Coast and travel back and forth on Amtrak, this is a long time coming. But I put this conversation into that context because for all the definitional changes that we're talking about, and for all the funding that the federal government has even put forward or might put forward, at the end of the day, the design and delivery of this infrastructure is quintessentially local in the United States. It's really cities and counties working closely with their states and private and civic sectors that ultimately have to prioritize, design, deliver, align, coordinate. So we all look to Washington and the legislative machinations to see what they'll do. But at the end of the day, this becomes local. And mayors and advocates and practitioners really have an enormous say in both what we fund and how we fund it, and whether it can advance inclusive and sustainable and innovative outcomes. So with that context, I want to turn, again, let's defer to our electeds. I want to defer to someone who counts Philadelphia as a second home, Mayor Holt, and ask you both to talk about your Philly cred, but also to talk about how you define and how you prioritize infrastructure in a city like Oklahoma City, which really has invested in infrastructure to a great extent. So Mayor Holt, great to see you again and look forward to your thoughts.
Yes, well, likewise, Bruce, it's great to be with you. You are no stranger to Oklahoma City, and we are no strangers to each other. As was already referenced, you're like a patron saint to urban theorists and policymakers. So, and we're very blessed here in Oklahoma City that you've worked with us specifically on some projects through the years. And then you and I have worked together through Mayor Garcetti's Accelerator for America. And I'm just sad that we haven't been in the same room for some time, I guess, like as is the case with most of the people in our lives. But I have been able to cross virtual paths with you a few times over this last year. And it's great to spend this much time with you tonight. And I guess, yeah, I'll get it out of the way. You referenced it, but Philly, it's wonderful as well to be with a Philadelphia audience this evening, because so you wouldn't necessarily guess this, but the mayor of Oklahoma City does have quite a few linkages with the city of Philadelphia, because I left here to go to college in 1997, and there at George Washington University in DC, I met Rachel Canuso, who was a daughter of Philadelphia, graduate of Episcopal Academy, uncle is Vito Canuso, sometimes well known to some of the politicos of Philadelphia for having been the chairman of the Philadelphia Republican Party for 25 years, and daughter of Casey and Nick Canuso. Well, she came down to DC for college. That's where we met. We ultimately fell in love, got married at St. Mark's down in Center City, and had our reception at the Union League. And, you know, several times a year pre-pandemic, I have spent my entire adult life coming to Philadelphia to visit family, to visit my in-laws, and they are now residing full-time at the Jersey Shore, where we will be next month. So I am very familiar with Wawas and down the shore, and, you know, all the language quirks and policy and political history, at least in recent years, of Philadelphia, and many friends there because of all of that I just described. So great to be with you tonight and to be able to talk a little policy with some of my Philadelphia friends. So you referenced obviously the topic of the night, which is infrastructure. To give a little baseline understanding of Oklahoma City and our approach to infrastructure, and then I'll kind of explain a little bit about how that has gotten creative and perhaps a forerunner of national conversations. But first, let me start with the basics. I mean, most people, obviously, their first instinct with infrastructure is to think of streets and water pipes and, you know, just the basic things that make an urban place run. And obviously, we're no different. We are different in one regards. We are massive, so we need a lot of infrastructure. We are 620 square miles. That is about the size, depending which ones you select, of 5 to 6 or 7 large American cities that you could easily name, could all fit inside the city limits of Oklahoma City. So that's a unique challenge that we've put in front of ourselves. You know, obviously, you might ask, well, why is that? Why did you make yourself so big? Well, you know, we were built around the automobile. We're not an old city like Philadelphia. Most of our development has occurred you know, in the century or so since automobiles became widespread, and we just embraced that. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to have lots of land and nice properties for everybody, regardless of socioeconomic status? And if we get tired of a building, we'll just move farther out, and we'll start, you know, we'll just build more. And so, you know, we've just sprawled out across 620 square miles, which obviously presents major challenges for street upkeep and for police response times, and, you know, a transit system that is adequate. And you can just imagine, to meet those needs, to meet those basic needs, we have fallen into a good habit, a successful habit, of passing bond issues every decade or so. Everything in Oklahoma, everybody's going to have their own quirky laws. Here in Oklahoma, we've got to put everything through a vote of the people if it relates to taxes. So everything I'm going to describe tonight has been presented to the voters of Oklahoma City. These are not things we can do without their input. We do not have the luxury, or however you want to look at it, or the downside of being able to do these things just among the elected officials. We always have to put these types of initiatives before the voters. So every decade or so, we have a tradition now of several decades where we'll go out to the voters with what is now about $1 billion worth of core infrastructure paid for through property taxes that actually technically pay off bonds that we sell. And that's a whole financial thing, but that's not an uncommon method of financing projects at the municipal level. About 25 years ago, a little more now, gosh, almost 30, 1993, we started to expand our view of infrastructure a little bit, and then got even more adventurous, I'd say, in the last few years. And I'll tell that story briefly. But we started, and Bruce, you know this well, but we started passing these 1-cent temporary sales tax initiatives we called MAPs. So MAPs is just a branding acronym. It stands for Metropolitan Area Projects. There's nothing magical about the name. It is, however, very well known now in Oklahoma City, because everybody here kind of ties our city's renaissance over the last quarter century back to the first passage of MAPs. So MAPs is not a bond issue. In fact, it's pay as you go, and it's not paid for by property tax. It's a sales tax. Here in Oklahoma, cities are predominantly reliant on sales tax for our operations. And we've been typically turning to property tax for those capital infrastructure needs. But here we decided, let's do a temporary, in this case, 5-year sales tax, and let's build some infrastructure things that are kind of fun, things we don't have, but things we need. I mean, the original maps was a sports arena, a canal in our entertainment district, not because we were needing the transportation, but because it was just a neat kind of amenity to build around, much like people may know of in San Antonio's Riverwalk. We had a brick town, our ballpark, a baseball, AAA stadium downtown. We put dams on our river. We have a river, but at the time it had to be mowed twice a year. It was a ditch, and the Army Corps of Engineers had done a fantastic job keeping the city from flooding, but they had completely drained the river of any of its characters. So we put dams on it just to hold some water, just really for aesthetic purposes at that point. So there were some other projects as well, but those are some of the most transformative ones. And again, none of what I just described is necessary for human survival in the same way that water infrastructure, street infrastructure, or public safety infrastructure might be. But as it kind of turned out, and nobody understands this better than you, Bruce, and other urban theorists, you got to have that stuff if anybody is going to live in your city. I mean, people don't just need they're not just looking for basic survival, they're looking for a high quality of life, and they have other options, and they can vote with their feet in this country. So we found that we were losing, especially young people, to other places that just had more going on. So we built some fun infrastructure in that first iteration of MAPS. That MAPS brand throughout the course of the 1990s became so popular and so appreciated that the next mayor, so the first mayor who did all that was Ron Norick. And then the next mayor, he said, well, we've got a kind of an epidemic of rundown school buildings. We've got to do something about that. Schools are actually not, in our form of government, the traditional purview of the city, but the school district had kind of exhausted its political capital. And so the city stepped up and said, we'll do another sales tax, this time for 7 years. Again, for a penny, again, pay as you go, no debt. We'll just pay cash for all these things. So they'll all be debt free when they open. And they called it Maps for Kids. They were basically just took the brand and applied it to a different initiative. In this case, the children of our city and the school buildings in which they were educated. So that was successful in the sense that it rebuilt most of our inner city school district buildings. And then my predecessor, Mayor Cornett, and that we kind of reached the point in the story where Bruce knows these people. Bruce has definitely worked closely with my predecessor, Mick Cornett. Well, Mick came along, and by now, MAPS really was a national story. It had really transformed Oklahoma City. And the crowning achievement, the cherry on top that really got everybody's attention was when we achieved major league sports status. We got the Thunder of the National Basketball Association. I always say that in America, the closest thing we have to bestowing a blue ribbon on our top cities is a major league sports team. And if you don't have one, you are made to feel as if you were in an alternate universe outside of American pop culture. You are not relevant. It's easy for Philadelphians to take that for granted because you have a team in every single major league sport, but we never had any of those. And so to get the NBA team, to get the Thunder was kind of a validation that all these investments in ourselves had really meant something. And obviously one of them specifically, the arena, made it truly possible. But all of it worked together to kind of build a city where that could have happened. So anyways, Mick achieves that early in his tenure. About 2008 was when we officially got the Thunder after a kind of a trial period with the Hornets after Hurricane Katrina. And in 2009, he had his opportunity to go forward with the MAPS initiative. And it was, again, kind of returning to the MAPS 1 model. It was a lot of downtown stuff, things we needed, things we didn't have, things that were not core infrastructure, but were quality of life infrastructure, like a convention center and a 70-acre urban park. Now our river, having put dams on it, suddenly had turned into a rowing destination, something people in Philly are familiar with, but yours may be more historic, but ours is probably better as a race course. It's a nice straightaway. And in Maps 3, we put in lights to become really the only lit race course in at least in America for rowing. And we put in a whitewater rafting facility right next door. So it's not biologically the same water as the river, but it is adjacent to the river, and it is a true full-blown whitewater rafting course suitable for the Olympics. And we have become an Olympic training facility over the last few years. And so all of that was a part of Maps 3, as well as a streetcar to link up downtown. You know, I mean, a streetcar is not light rail. It is not a commuter type of transportation, but it kind of links together all the different destinations, at least in the downtown core. So that was Maps 3. That was a nearly 8-year tax. So that was, you know, well into this decade. And then I came along. I had been chief of staff to Mayor Cornett when that passed. I had then taken a sabbatical to the Oklahoma Senate, where I served for 8 years. And I came back and was elected mayor in 2018 and was presented, you know, with the opportunity, because I want to remind you from the political side of this, these sales taxes for maps roll off. They're always temporary. That's part of the passage, you know, of it is being able to say, well, it's going to go away. You know, it's not permanent. It's just, here's the projects we're going to do. And here's the number of years we're going to collect the revenue to fund them. And then that's it. And then we'll come, if we want to do more, we'll come back to you and we'll have to ask again. Well, that's how it worked. And so in 2019, with Maps 3 having expired, we had the opportunity to go to the voters for a Maps 4. At this point, we've just settled into sort of like, you know, like a movie series. We just numbered them now like sequels. So we present a Maps 4 to the voters. And I think what's interesting, and this is really, I think, what maybe caught Larry's eye, because he heard me talking about this, and it's really a bit of a forerunner to some of the national conversations that are happening right now about infrastructure. So we had really addressed most of these downtown needs. The things that I've described had kind of finished out really most of the items that people would associate with the great American downtown. And, you know, even though Maps is still very popular, you get a little pushback after a while. You know, it's all downtown. Why doesn't it affect, you know, the neighborhoods? Why doesn't it improve, you know, my daily life? You know, and why doesn't it hit on multiple socioeconomic levels? You know, I mean, it's all well and good to have the Thunder, but that's not, you know, not everybody can afford those tickets. So, you know, what are you doing for me and my neighborhood? And how can Maps, how can this magic of Maps that has meant so much to our city be extended across the city and to all of our residents? And I really took that to heart, you know, and I think, again, politically recognizing that this has to pass, I also was mindful of the idea that we needed to have a Maps that, you know, really met people where they were at this time around, if we were even going to pass it. And so we spent a year having a very inclusive process. We had 25 hours of council meetings where people came in and talked about their dreams and talked about specific projects. And we ultimately crafted a package of 16 projects totaling a cost of almost $1 billion, paid for by an 8-year, 1-cent temporary sales tax. And here's where we deviate a little bit from the past history of Maps and from maybe a conventional view of infrastructure, in that all of these things that we build are buildings, so they are infrastructure. I mean, you got to have buildings for all of the things I'm about to describe, but the needs are a little different, you know. And again, it's not, in this case, it's not core infrastructure, it's not streets and water pipes, but it's also not fun stuff necessarily. There's a little bit of that in here, but it's kind of more about human needs. It's about neighborhood improvement. And so in this case, we had $140 million for parks to upgrade every neighborhood park in the city, of which we have over 150, and some of which are just a rusty swing set in a field. You know, I mean, they just haven't had the investment that they deserve. And you've got these beautiful, you know, you got these beautiful parks downtown now. With Scissortail Park is the Maps 3 park I was referencing earlier, and it's tremendous. I mean, it's $120 million park. It's unbelievable. But, you know, you get a little sense of like, maybe we need to at least bring some of our neighborhood parks to some kind of level like that. So that was in there. We also had $110 million for youth centers. So again, if you were to tour our senior and youth centers that have been built, 50, 60 years ago, you wouldn't think that that's something to write home about. And so we needed to upgrade youth centers, put something really state of the art out there that we could be proud of. And again, so both of those projects totaling $250 million, you're talking about human needs, you're talking about neighborhood needs, and you're expanding perhaps the conventional definition of what infrastructure is. But at the end of the day, it's infrastructure, it's buildings, but it's buildings that are meeting maybe in a more expanded definition of what a city needs. So we also returned to a project that we'd done in MAPS 3. We're adding some more senior wellness centers. These are much like the youth centers, state of the art, really upgrading what we had in the past. And then here's where we're really getting interesting. We have a project for $40 million for mental health and addiction centers. Now, you're going to think some of the things I'm describing surely have some operating costs. These aren't just, you don't just build buildings for these things and walk away. And there's no question of that. Some of these depend on operational dollars likely provided by the state or other partners. And all of that was contemplated. And all of that, I believe, will eventually work out. But it leaves a little extra homework to make sure that we can, operate these things moving forward. There was also a family justice center. That's for people in the domestic violence service provider community. That's a phrase that they'll be familiar with. But ours is called Palomar. It was founded a few years ago, but it needs a new building. A permanent building, and that's what is contemplated here. We also have transit. We can always do more on that. We're kind of also working, pun intended, on a parallel track with a regional transit authority to invest more in transit. But in this case, we wanted to have at least some transit in MAPS 4. And so we have 2 bus rapid transit lines contemplated as part of the MAPS 4 transit package. We've got sidewalks, bike lanes, trails, street lights, pedestrian amenities, bicycle amenities that, again, in a city of 620 square miles built around the automobile, you can just imagine we don't have a lot of sidewalks and bike lanes. We have some. We've invested in a pretty good trail system through MAPS, but we just need to do more. Homelessness, $50 million for affordable housing. Probably the first $50 million, the first $10 that the city has ever spent really on that endeavor. And that's pretty groundbreaking for Oklahoma City. And then also some fun stuff. We've got 115 to continue upgrading the arena. We've got almost 100 million in total for a new Coliseum at basically an arena at our fairgrounds. We happen to be the horse show capital of the world. And so there's kind of a tourism need out there at the fairgrounds. And we also have about $38 million for a multi-purpose stadium. We don't have a stadium at all in Oklahoma City other than high school stadiums, which we think we're kind of the top 50 city in America, the only top 50 city that doesn't have something like that. So that's in there as well. But we also, again, have things like a new animal shelter. We have a diversion hub that's a phrase I think we've invented here, but it's a place for people interacting with the criminal justice system to get services, mental health, jobs, substance abuse services. We've got an investment, and this is going to be near and dear to your heart, Bruce, in the Innovation District, placemaking in that part of our city. And I say that because Bruce was an author of a Brookings Institution report on our Innovation District and what it could be. And this is one of our first major commitments to that vision. And we also have, and I want to remind you, this was in 2019, not in the summer of 2020 that we passed this. We have $25 million for restoration of our kind of historic home of the NAACP, and around that, a civil rights center telling our civil rights story and honoring specifically our greatest civil rights pioneer here in Oklahoma City, a woman named Clara Luper. But it's obviously both backwards looking, but it's also supposed to be very forwards looking, and letting that story inspire a new generation of our residents. And a lot of people have followed probably the activities in Tulsa this week. We're a couple hours down the turnpike from Tulsa, and though we don't have an incident so horrifying as that, we have many smaller horrifying incidents and a history of segregation that lasted well into the 60s. that Clara Luper was fighting against. And much like how the story in Tulsa wasn't told to younger generations, the story in Oklahoma City of our past and our civil rights movement is not historically told here. So we want to remedy that through the creation of this Civil Rights Center. And we also have money for beautification. And also, I would say, just as a word of innovation that I'm proud of, inside of this $1 billion is about $100 million for some endowments to fund the operations of some of these structures, not all, but it helps us kind of solve one riddle we've had with MAPS through the years, which has been, how do you fund the operations with a temporary tax? You know, it's just it's temporary taxes are only good for building things. So we're trying to be somewhat creative here. I've never really seen government do this very often, but setting aside some funds and letting our money make money just like a university or a wealthy family might, and allowing some of these dollars to really fund the operations of these projects into perpetuity. And that's, I could have a whole hour just on that interesting topic. But the main point here is that with MAPS 4 passed just under 2 years ago, we have invested here in Oklahoma City in infrastructure, but in a new definition of infrastructure and a type of infrastructure that's meeting very human needs, that's meeting people at all socioeconomic levels. And again, I think is a bit of a precursor to a lot of the conversations that are happening right now in Washington around an infrastructure package, as people are kind of redefining what infrastructure really is to the American people in the year 2021. I think in Oklahoma City, we're already well into that process. So that's a very long answer, but you asked me a short question that had a long answer, Bruce. And so I'm happy to dig deeper into any of that. But that's the lay of the land. That's why David Holt calls Philadelphia his second home, and that's the lay of the land on infrastructure here in my fine city, Oklahoma City.
Well, first of all, for everyone on this call, I think just hearing the MAP story and the sequencing of this sort of gives folks an understanding of what you can do when you engage your citizenry in your community to revitalize and regenerate and really become a world-class city. So for anyone who's not been to Oklahoma City, it is an incredible place to visit. I didn't do the whitewater rafting because, I'm not sure I thought I would survive that. But, I think I've done all the other bits. Shalini, you're coming from, first of all, you do need to tell folks, if you want, what's your Philly cred, because you are engaged in Philadelphia in some interesting ways. But I regard you as really as a vanguard thinker and doer on next generation energy and resilient infrastructure and water and sewer infrastructure, drawing from examples from all over the world, but then adapting and applying them to the United States. So how do you define infrastructure and how do you prioritize it? Because to some extent, the country's caught up with Oklahoma City here.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Larry and the Citizen, for having us. Mayor Holt, it's great to have you lead the way in talking about infrastructure as fun, because I always joke that we work on the things that everybody cares about when they break and no one cares about when they don't. And so in my world, so I lead a firm called Refocus Partners, and we work with federal agencies and cities across the US and around the world to really tackle problems of resilience. What's the stuff where success is something that doesn't happen? A storm hit, but your community wasn't devastated. And often that's the hardest stuff to fund because it's so reactive. And so what I love about the MAP story and how Mayor Holt laid out the whole story arc here is that it really is a program that encourages proactive thinking versus reactive. What do we need? What do we want? And how do we know the difference between what we need and what we want? Because so often the fun stuff is also necessary and it gets shoved to the side because you look in your wallet and you run out of money. And so what my team and I do, we are all former public servants in some shape or form, having worked from the federal to the local level. And we work on problems of big infrastructure, so $100 million plus projects that cities and counties are having a terrible time getting funded, and where a piecemeal solution does not do the job. So I want you to think about a seawall or a coastal protection. Building a half a mile of a seawall is worth exactly less than nothing of half a mile of that seawall if it doesn't cover the whole area you're trying to protect. So we always come in thinking about infrastructure as solving comprehensive problems. And so from the start, my work in my former life at the US EPA was really looking at citywide water and sewer problems, for example. And how could you do things like use money from landslide protection to fund water infrastructure? Because in some ways, the cheapest solution in one sector is something you do in another sector. The water sector is often the biggest power user in a city. And so we developed this unusual kind of approach to thinking about infrastructure where you zoom out and you don't necessarily look at the sector or the type. So we don't think about this infrastructure as a collection of roads or bridges. We kind of have 4 buckets of projects that we think really serve community needs. The first are the kinds of things that you heard Mayor Holt describe, right? These are things that enable growth, that enable well-being of residents in a city. And that can be everything from an arena to a bike path. The second category is a little bit different. It's things that you can do together in ways that you couldn't do separately. So one of our signature projects is one that we worked on with the city of Hoboken after Hurricane Sandy. And for those of you who, I think all the Philadelphians have probably some familiarity with Hoboken. Hoboken is exactly 1 square mile and almost 98% paved. And it was under about 12 feet of water after Hurricane Sandy. So there were people trapped in upper story apartments for 2 weeks without power. So I want you to think about older residents. And the hospital was completely flooded out because the sewer system broke underneath it. So devastating event. And we came in to work with the city as part of a competition we designed. And what was really striking was the mayor at that time, Mayor Don Zimmer, really understood that this wasn't just about responding to what had immediately happened. I think there's such a tendency to be reactive after a disaster and just try to become whole again, that there's a missed opportunity to become better. And that really is our post-COVID opportunity as well. But Mayor Zimmer opened the door to asking slightly different questions in Hoboken. We said, what do you need most? And she said, obviously, flood protection, right? But when we pushed a little bit on top of that, she and her team did some phenomenal work and said, look, we need parking. We had cars floating down the street in Sandy, and that's a clear sign of we're prioritizing our streets for cars, not people. So we need a different way to think about parking, and we need recreational space. There's not enough green space here for kids, for older people. And so what our team did, I'm an architect and an engineer by training and a reformed Politico along the way. But we developed a design solution for an old 6-acre industrial site, and we combined a parking garage with green infrastructure. So I want you to think about this like a bathtub and a sponge to hold floodwater. Where the parking revenues helped pay for the flood protections. So we weren't trying to do some financial magic of wringing more money out of a water utility to play for flood infrastructure that they couldn't afford. What we said are, what are 2 things that you can do together to get more value than you would separately? So in Hoboken's case, they now have what's called the Northwest Resiliency Park, which is about a $90 million project that we helped develop the initial plans for and get the first $30 million worth of funding. And that's going to be built next year. And it has all the fun stuff that Mayor Holt was talking about. There's an ice rink, there's an amphitheater, there's beautiful green space, and it's paid for by a combination of water and parking fees. And so the second bucket of infrastructure is really, how do you put things together in ways that they make a comprehensive solution, where if you looked at them separately, you would end up with projects that never got built. And then the last 2 categories that we really think about are, we often ask the question, who loses money when you don't build something? And this is a very, very useful question when it comes to things like coastal protection. Who loses money when you don't protect the Gulf Coast of the US? Well, it turns out it's the airline industry, or it turns out it's the hotel industry. And so often we think about infrastructure as being locally constructed, and we miss the chance to think about the wider net of beneficiaries who would really like to see a project get done. And what this particular bucket for us does is it really helps us zoom out past city budget constraints. because oftentimes it's a water utility or an electric utility or a railway company that is the most benefited by something a city owns and is struggling to maintain. So the most complex, and I think kind of partway example of this, is the city of San Francisco's seawall under the Embarcadero. So this is a 6-mile seawall, I think, 4-mile seawall, estimated at $6 billion in upgrade costs. So this is a very, very old piece of infrastructure that is propping up a $75 billion set of assets that will slide into the San Francisco Bay if it's not earthquake proofed. So it's a tremendous infrastructure challenge. If you look at this as the responsibility of the Port of San Francisco, you miss the opportunity for how we can pay for these things differently and value infrastructure differently. And what we don't often think about is pieces of infrastructure that shore up everything else. So inside the San Francisco Embarcadero seawall are all the major utilities. And so these are the kinds of things that when we flip that question around and ask who loses money when we don't maintain this asset or when we don't upgrade this asset, it really gives you a different perspective on how you can do system redesign. It also helps us think about cities like Gary, Indiana and Detroit, where you have an albatross of a water system, for example, that was built for a city that was 1/3 bigger, 2/3 bigger, 3 times larger. And the utility and the city are saddled with maintaining these assets in a way that don't enable them to do something different. You're stuck with what you've got. And so flipping this around to say, where do we lose money, also helps at the federal level, because all those losses trickle up when you have big disasters or failures to invest. And so it lets us cut across types of infrastructure and get into things like affordable housing and dealing with homelessness and really tackling structural issues that lead you to infrastructure solutions, but may not start there, or vice versa. And then the last category of priorities that we've got are legacy, things that we call legacy assets. And this really is part of the racial reckoning that we're all confronting, which is there were things built to divide. There were things built to disenfranchise. And if we don't think about infrastructure in terms of how we invest in taking the things that don't work down, we're perpetually going to leave the communities that have had these assets put in place to disenfranchise further and further behind. And so we really look at this from the perspective of growth, multiple wins, who loses money, and then how do you deal with legacy challenges? And that for us is what defines infrastructure and enables solutions that look more like traditional infrastructure, but don't start there with the question. We never start by saying we're building a bridge or a seawall.
I think both of you, without really, just so everyone on this call knows, without really any prep, have both redefined infrastructure, but also have been so imaginative and creative in the design, finance, and delivery of different kinds of infrastructure. And I want to pose this question to both of you, because I do think that if we take President Biden's Build Back Better mantra, in some respects, what we haven't heard really from the national government is it will require us to do things differently, both at the local level in how we think about infrastructure and do what the multiple wins or a multi-sector approach, but also at the federal level, because the federal level, as Shalini and I know, having both served at the national level, the federal government likes to fund projects through compartmentalized vertical silos. They don't really do holistic integrated plans. And so I think what essentially we're about to see is a stress on the system in a good way to do things differently locally. Now that could be institutional structures, that could be community engagement, that could be multiple things, but also to force a different kind of federalism between the national government, local. And I thought it would be helpful for both of you to comment on that, because you don't really hear anything about that in the national media or through national discourse. It's just the federal government funds stuff and it happens, right? Well, there's a couple other bits on the way. So any thoughts about how we don't just build back better, but do things differently? So New Deal led to lots of, structural change. The post-war era in the United States, we basically created all the public authorities we have now in the country, ports and airports and transportation and convention and stadium, parking, and all the rest. How do we do things differently this time around?
Mayor Holt, I'll start, but then I want to flip it into a question for you as well. Bruce, from the federal side, I think there are 4 colors of money, and the federal government is good at one of these 4, right? So the 4 colors that we think are most important are the pre-development money, actually getting the ideas of what to build so that you can write a federal grant application takes time and expertise and money. And very rarely do you get that. So Mayor Holt, I'm so excited to hear, how did you develop these 16 projects enough to be compelling to your residents? So that's the pre-development money. The second color is the design and engineering. How do you actually take it from something on a napkin where we combine a parking garage as a bathtub to hold the flood water, looks cute, but can you build it? That's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, getting the engineers, making sure you could build it, that it's a real thing. And then there's the construction money, right? This is what the federal government does well. They spend the money that's in the $500 to $500 million, right? Depending on the size of the project. And then the last category is operations and maintenance, and they are just outright terrible at that. That's something that all levels of government struggle with. And so I think, Mayor Holt, the maps work on the front end and the back end is fascinating because you've managed to take ideas, make them compelling and real, marshal real resources to them, and then maintain them. So I'm really curious how you've done the bookends of that.
Yeah, well, I think all the MAPS initiatives have in common that they were meeting a need that was evident to leadership in the community, but also had to be either evident to the public or explained to the public in a way that made it compelling, because ultimately they were going to have to vote to pay for it. And I suppose as I explain that, I'd also point out that all of that is transferable to this infrastructure package, because whatever the federal government comes up with, they're not going to have to pass through a vote of the American people, but it would be nice if it was compelling to the American people. They will face votes someday, based on this track record. And it would also be nice if, like MAPS, it's meeting a need, and our needs are all going to be a little different in our different communities. So I think that's maybe a conversation for another day, but certainly dovetails with what Bruce was just saying about federalism. I mean, we've done a really good job in Oklahoma City on water infrastructure. I mean, sure, we'll always take any water infrastructure money anybody wants to give us, but where our needs really are in, street resurfacing and our transit system. And that comes from, both of those comes from the thing I was talking about earlier about the sprawl of our city. Well, that's different than other places. There are other cities, especially older cities, that the water infrastructure is their absolute #1 top priority and need. So if we're all a little different, you would hope that an infrastructure plan that comes out of the federal government finds a way to meet the different needs in different cities and gives us each what we find compelling. So back to your question, though, of how we developed MAPS, and especially MAPS 4, with which I'm most familiar. I mean, we came out, I had a slick video in the fall of 2019, a few months after I had taken office, and you can find it still today on YouTube. And I said, it's time to dream big, Oklahoma City. It's time to do MAPS again. What is it we want to do for the next 10 years in this community? And then you just sort of sit back and you let, we had a website, but so you're getting ideas over the course, if you give it time. This is not something I felt I wanted to rush. I put out that call for ideas. I put that out over a year before I knew the vote needed to occur. And so you just kind of sat back at that point. All these ideas are flying in, either through the website, either through people who maybe have a better wherewithal of how to get things done, or who are coming and meeting with the mayor or meeting with council members, or even kind of out in the community trying to build like a grassroots movement for certain things. You saw a little bit of that. And then just, it's a balance of things I perceive to be needs, balance that other city leaders perceive to be needs, plus these things that I might not have occurred to me if not for somebody else kind of coming forward and bringing it to our attention. And I think a lot of the projects fit that model. I mean, I wouldn't profess that those 16 projects are what David Holt thought in 2018 when I was running for mayor. And I'm sorry, I got my timeline a little mixed up. It was 2018 when we had the call for ideas, and 2019 when we had the vote. But in 2018, when I was running for mayor, I wasn't necessarily that these were my 16 priorities, but they became my 16 priorities as I started to really interact with my voters and on the topic of Maps 4, and discovered what it was that they really cared about and would really find value in. And so, you know, you move through that process over the course of several months. And then over the summer of 19, we had all these council meetings. We set these agendas where we would hear about 3 or 4 of the different projects, and they took all day long. And from 9 to 5, we sat there, and this was of course pre-COVID. So, you know, the chamber was packed and people came in, and literally anybody who wanted to speak could speak for 3 minutes, you know, and we would say, okay, you know, first we're going to talk about the Family Justice Center. And so Palomar would kind of come up with their prepared presentation, but then literally anybody else who wanted to talk for or against it, you know, would then speak for hours. And it was really cool, honestly, if you're kind of like just a democracy nerd, you know. I mean, it was fun to, most of the time that hundreds of people have descended on City Hall, it's bad, you know, they're not happy. But this was more of a hopeful, sort of idealistic experience. And it built the momentum for the projects in the campaign. Ultimately, I was able to kind of finagle all the things that we heard presentations on into the package. So nobody was really disappointed. Maybe people got a little bit of a haircut in terms of the projected budget for their project, but we kind of got it all crammed in there. That's why there's 16 projects. And you know, there was a little malleability there, because it's like, how long does the tax last? I mean, those are all things we could play with. That nothing was written in stone other than the cent. The 1 cent was sort of sacred, but everything else we could kind of maneuver. So ultimately, you know, come out with this 16 project plan. And then, you know, I've got to do the hard work of getting, in my view, I wanted to get a unanimous vote out of the council. That wasn't necessary legally, but I just wanted that kind of consensus. And that all, we got that unanimous vote, and it just sort of all cascaded into a successful election. And I neglected to say earlier, we got 72% of the vote for a tax upon ourselves in Oklahoma City. And that was by far the highest level ever for a MAPS tax or any sales tax in Oklahoma City history. And 72% in December of 19. I mean, this political environment we've been in is not recent. This has been going on for several years. And so I want to remind you that, especially in a purple city like Oklahoma City, that meant that a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats voted the same way on that day. And it was because we had a package that reflected the pluralistic society in which we live, and there were things for everybody in that package, and that was okay. It wasn't supposed to be just what one group of people would find pleasing. So that was how we built up to a successful election. And obviously that's not all of that is necessary for the federal government to emulate, because they don't have to have a vote of the people at the end of this. But I think it was a model of how to have an inclusive process that pleased 72% of people. You can't please everybody, and you're never going to get 100%, but 72 for a tax vote, you know, is about as good as you can get.
Boy, that's amazing. Thank you, Mayor Holt. And Bruce, there are a couple questions I'm going to try, and if we can just do a quick lightning round here to get a couple of questions in. This has been a terrific discussion. Question from Robert Ravelli. How can local government, and this relates to what you were talking about, Shalini, how can local governments undo the damage of urban freeways? The New York Times did a great article on this last week, and the Biden Infrastructure Initiative plans to somehow address this. Can you speak to that?
I can. I'll actually pop a link into the chat. My colleague Joe Kane, who's at Brookings in the Metro program, and I wrote a pair of articles exactly on how to address these legacy infrastructure problems. And so happy to follow up on that one through the chat. But it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. It's not, the damage is longstanding and deep.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that which is made by bad policy choices can be undone by smart policy, right?
In fact,
We sometimes think of this stuff as just carved in stone after a while. Ann Gemmell, who is an evangelist in Philadelphia for future proofing the workforce, and writes a terrific column occasionally for the Citizen, writes, great focus here on quality of life, resilience, and wellness. Yet, how to measure? A few years ago, California started using the Social Progress Index as a complement to GDP. Are any of you aware of other cities or states using this as a way to measure outcomes and social progress or impact? Anyone? Mayor Holt?
I'm not specifically familiar with that, but yeah, I mean, you know, obviously we are, and I think this is a fair comment, you know, as we develop maps 4, we're getting into areas that are harder and harder to measure, you know, whether they're successful or not. And we had some pushback from people, even on the council, who were like, you know, how 10 years from now, how can we judge that this mental health crisis center, this homeless funding, you know, whatever, you know, really made a difference? And yeah, I think that's an open question, but I'm interested in hearing more about what the questioner is offering as a model out there for measuring that type of activity.
Yeah, Larry, I can speak to this a little bit more too, because it's very much a part of our work. A lot of our financing work depends on getting this measurement right, because the benefits are successes that don't happen, right? So the flood that didn't happen you have to know in advance what it is you're trying to prevent. And so we actually look directly for, you know, where you have changes in the budget. So think about transit and heat. Transit systems run more slowly in high heat. The more hot it gets, the fewer you run the trains. And who do you leave sitting out? Transit dependent workers and old people. And so you can actually track directly, not just to who loses money, but also who suffers. And separating out those two things often helps you make the local case for a project, but also the financial case. And so we don't really like the one size fits all metrics. That's more helpful for kind of rolling things up in global reporting. The project specific metrics where you actually show reduced risk, reduced cost, health benefits are the ones that we use directly.
Wonderful. The only other thing that occurs to me is I buried the lead when I talked about Mayor Holt and didn't mention in the People's Republic of Philadelphia that he is a Republican mayor, and you wouldn't have thought that given the list of infrastructure initiatives that you ran off, and you know, we had Mayor Savanti Myrick from Ithaca at our Ideas We Steal Festival, and he used this line that I thought of in relation to you and the job you're doing. He said there are 3 political parties in America. There are Democrats, there are Republicans, and there are mayors. Can you speak to the pragmatic nature of what you as a Republican have done in terms of infrastructure and other issues as well?
Sure. So mayors have no choice but to get things done, right? We do not consider it an accomplishment to have a press conference, right? We have to keep our community moving forward. And most of the exposure that people get to politicians in our day and age is for people at the state and federal levels who really have the luxury of treating politics as if it is entertainment or as if it is a game. And in our case, however, at the local level, it is real life. And so I find, and I'm sure everybody on this panel is having worked so much with cities, that there is no major difference between the way a Republican mayor or a Democratic mayor governs. I mean, you can nitpick for sure, but I mean, at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, and any group of hundreds of thousands of human beings are ultimately going to come to some sort of consensus outcome that is probably not that different depending on your political party or where you live. And so that's why mayors get along so great. And if we're hopefully doing our jobs, we get things done in a way that is unrecognizable at other levels of government, at least in the last couple decades. And so I'm proud to be a mayor. And when people ever talk about, they think that, outside of the political process, they think that this is just this natural movement up, to governor or senate or something. I'm thinking, to me, that is at worst a lateral move, because I get to be the leader of a community that is actually making a difference and actually is able to lay out a vision and then effectively execute it in a way that I don't see happen at any other level of government right now. So no, and to your more specific question about Oklahoma City and how Maps 4 was developed, I mean, again, look, I have a purple city. I have a city that the county in which Oklahoma City resides voted for Donald Trump by 1 point. So it's basically 50-50. And so I have no choice but to pursue outcomes that are pleasing to both sides, at least the people in the middle. You know, maybe you can't, I can't, nor do I wish to please the QAnoners or the communists, right? But somewhere that 75% in the middle is what I'm trying to work with. And it can be done, especially if you have a nonpartisan form of government. Yeah, I'm a Republican, and people know that because I was a Republican in the Oklahoma Senate, but you know, I run nonpartisan, and so I face all the voters, and I take that seriously, and I consider that both an obligation and an opportunity to craft a coalition of people who are the 70% of people in the middle who just want to get things done. And I think most cities that operate in a nonpartisan form of government find that whether they elect a Republican or a Democrat, they get a good mayor out of that equation.
Well, this has been terrific, really inspiring. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know, if only the three of you were the government of Philadelphia, we'd be fine. Bruce, thank you again so much. And if you have any closing thoughts, you can wrap it up in that way that only you can.
Well, I think Shalini, Mayor Holt, this is how our cities are going to build back. With a broader definition, with federal investments, but more importantly, with local agency and local delivery. So this was a fantastic panel at a really propitious moment. So great to see both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Honored to be with you tonight.